All right, in this video, I'm going to show you how to read from different input sources in Java from a keyboard, which is probably one you know. I'm going to teach you how to read from a file, and I'm going to teach you how to read from the web. So let's start with a class. I'm going to call this class reader, and I'm going to import a few classes that I will need, right? I will need a scanner for sure, because a scanner is the main object in this class. Scanner can read anything. And then I'm going to import a URL because I need that. I'm going to import file because I need it from reading file. And then I'm going to import these classes that have exception at the end. These are exceptions. This is when something goes wrong, one of these classes will be instantiated and I will be able to work with it. So let's start by reading from the keyboard. I'm going to create methods or functions that will read from each one of these input sources. So let's do a readLine method. What readLine does is it's going to read from the keyboard and it's going to return the whatever was read as a string for me to do whatever I want later in the program. The way you read from the keyboard, you probably declare a scanner variable. I named it KBD, and that's going to be a new scanner, and the scanner is going to take the input from system.in, which right now and by default is the keyboard. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create the scanner. This says, hey, I'm ready to read from here. Okay? And the way I read from there are many ways to read, but one way that I'm going to use throughout is this next line. So in the variable keyword, I'll call the method next line, which will actually return whatever I typed in the keyboard minus the last enter or new line character. Once I have that input, I can just return it from the function, or the method. So the readLine method will actually create a scanner from system.in, wait for me to input a line, and then it will return that input. Now, reading a file is very similar. The only difference, though, is that a file, instead of having one line and me hitting enter, it has many lines. Now, files can be read into one string. Usually, you've probably been using strings as a way to display messages. So enter a number between 1 and 10, or sorry, your number must be greater than 5, or little messages, hello world. But in reality, a string is something that can hold a lot of text, and that really depends on the size of your computer's memory. You can hold a Bible in there, you can hold Wikipedia in there, right? You can hold large amounts of text. So any file that you find in your computer most likely can be put into a string, okay? So we're going to put a file into a string, the contents of a file into a string. I'm going to create a method called readFile that will take one parameter. That parameter is going to be the name of the file that I want to read. I will read that file and I will put it into a string that's going to be then returned. So the way I do this is first I create an empty string, contents, in which I'm going to be appending every line of the file. Then I have to use a try and catch block because now we're running into a few things. So what if the file doesn't exist, for example, right? What if there's a failure in my hard drive? So I'm going to do a try block, and within the try block, I'm going to try and go for everything, assuming everything's going to go right. So in there, I'm going to create a file, and I'm going to create a file object. Okay, I'm going to call it F because I'm not very original with names, and that's going to create a new file from this file name that I passed. So I don't know, recipes.txt or whatever, whatever file name I pass. Once I create that, I can create a new scanner just like I did for the keyboard. The only difference though is that now the scanner is not going to have system.in, but it's going to have my file object, right? And I've named this file scanner for the sake of originality, of lack of originality, I should say. So I name it file scanner. It will read from a file, and now I have a scanner, and I can use the same next line methods and all the scanner methods on this file. Because a file might have multiple lines, I'm going to use a while loop, right, where I do this test. File scanner, the variable that basically the scanner with the file now, I will check, does it have a next line that needs to be read? right? It starts from the very top of the file before even the first line begins and asks, is there a next line that I can read? And if the answer to this is true, then what I'm going to do is this scanner is going to read that next line minus the new line characters. It's going to read that next line and it will put it in contents, in my string contents that I will return later on. For the second line is the same thing. It's going to append it to whatever was there in contents to begin with. So it will read every line of the file. If there's a next line, it will read that line and append it to the variable contents. Then what I do is I need to close this file after the while loop is done. So after the last line, this has next line method is going to return false. And that's when the while loop ends, when there are no more lines to read. And then I'll close the scanner. I need to close the scanner. Files that are open through a scanner need to be closed. When the keyboard is open in the scanner, it doesn't really need to be closed. All right, and then I'm going to return, I'm going to close the file. Then I'm going to create the catch block. I'm going to try to trap the file not found exception. This is one of the things that can go wrong, right? So for example, I put a file name, recipes.txt, and that file is not in my hard drive, right? Then none of this is going to work because the file isn't there. So that throws an exception. Instead of me validating to see whether the file is there or not, I can just say, try to do this. If you can't, then see if this is what happened. And if file not found is what happened, then do this. Now, as you notice with an exception, all exceptions do the same thing. When you catch the exception class, and then you assign a variable name to that exception to be used later. You can use the methods. So I'll print oops, could not find file, and then I append the get message, the output of the get message method of the exception. We will see what that is. Well, assuming everything went well, I will just return the contents that I've concatenated. If something went wrong, I'll just return this empty string. And that's how you basically read a file from the file system. Now, how do you read a input from a web page? Now, web pages are basically files that live online. Your browser brings that file into it, and then because of it looks at the contents of the file and it knows how to display your web page. If you ever right-click on a web page and click on View Source, you will see what I mean. It's just a garble of language of HTML, the language to make web pages, and some text interlaid. And it tells the browser how to format that text. So let's try to read from a web page. I'm going to create another method called read URL. Okay. Now read URL will require a URL that I have to go fetch the web page from. And then again, I will do the exact same thing as a file. I will read that URL line by line, that was this web page, line by line. I will append it to some string variable and return it. So it's very similar. I create my contents variable that's going to hold all the content of the web page. I open my try and catch block, my try block. And if everything goes well, I should be able to first create a URL. And this is the URL object. Okay, I'm going to call it F because I really copied and pasted the code above. And it's going to be a new URL formed with the URL from this parameter. Now I need to create my scanner. And my scanner is slightly different, but I create a scanner. I will call it URL scanner. It's new scanner. And what I will do is call the OpenStream method of the URL object. Okay, so the URL object, F, has an OpenStream method. I'm going to call that. And that's how I create my scanner. Now my scanner is looking at a web page and it's able to read its contents. Because it's multiple lines, I'm going to do the exact same thing I did for a file. I'm going to say, well, the URL scanner has a next line. Basically, if there's stuff that needs to be read, well, then read that line, minus the new line character, and append it to my contents variable. Then I will close the URL scanner, and now it's time to catch exceptions. When dealing with URLs, you have to catch two exceptions. One is, what if the URL is not really a URL? It's like any string, like my name, right? Well, you got to be able to catch a malformed URL exception. And when that happens, when that exception happens, I'm just going to output oops, and then whatever message the exception brings in it. But then there's another exception. What if, say for example, I'm not connected to the network, right? Or what if the URL is correct, but it cannot find it? Well, there's a catch-all exception for reading URLs called the IO exception. This is anything that could go wrong in the input-output process, right? So here, if I catch that exception, I will print could not read the web page, and then I will output whatever message it gave me. So I have the code to do this right. I have the code to see what happens if it doesn't work. All that's left is that now I need to return the contents that I have collected here, or if something went wrong, the contents that I initialized here. And that is how you read a URL. By the way, at any point in time, pause this video and copy these methods. Now, let's see if this all works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a main method in this class. And in this main method, I'm going to create 3 strings, and I'm going to call each one of these functions with each one of these strings. So the first I'm going to create a reader. This class is a reader, right? If we scroll the way up, you see that I call this reader. And then with this reader, I'm going to create a string called contents of keyboard, and I'm going to call the readLine method, which returns whatever I type. Then I'm going to create a contents of file that's going to read a file test1.java. Actually, this file is right here, is in my folder. You see that? It'll return the contents of the file. And then I'm going to create the contents of a URL, read URL, this URL. If you look at that URL, you can actually see that it's an actual web page. Okay? Now, just so you know, look at what test1.java does. Test1.java, it has this public test1. It's very simple stuff, right? Unfortunately, I cannot open the browser to show you this, but we will see. Now I have 3 strings, one with whatever I enter from the keyboard, one with whatever comes from the file, the contents of the file, and one with the contents of the URL. Now what I need to do is print these out. So I create a series of print line items. For example, here I'll say you entered contents of keyboard. The file you read, new line, it's contents of file. The web page you read, new line, the contents of URL. So we're ready to compile this program. Let's compile it. I'm using JGrasp, by the way, and run this program. So now it's waiting for a keyword from the input, because that's the first thing. So I'm going to say, from keyboard, enter. Whoops. So here's what happens. I push from keyboard, I click enter, and then it did this part. Then it went and did this, and it did this, and then it started the printing process. And it says, you entered from keyboard. That's what I enter in the keyboard. Then the separator lines right there. Then it said the file you read, new line. The file you read, new line. And look at this. This is the content of the file. Public class test1, static in P, in Q, my test class. Let's look at test1. Public test1, static in P, in Q, my test class. The only difference is that there are no new line characters. So it doesn't show like going down like this. It shows all one big line, because the next line method of the scanner removes that new line. Okay. And then the web page you read, right here, new line, that's the contents of the URL. This is the code of the web page that I went to. You can actually go there and see that this is stuff that is actually on that URL. Now, let's do a little modification here. In my read file, I'm going to append each line to the contents, but I'm going to append the line, and I am going to actually append the new line character. Okay, I'm going to compile and run it. Remember, I have to enter something from the keyboard here, right? So hello, and then look at this. Now, because I appended the new lines, well, you entered hello because that's from the keyboard, but the file I read, because I appended the new lines that next line removes, I actually got the class that looks like a Java class, right? It looks just like this, minus the colors, right? And then my web page, I did not append the new lines, so it looks like just one big line. But this is basically how you read from the keyboard, a file, and from a URL. Now you have this strings here, and you can do whatever you want. You can test to see if the file contains something, you can split it, you can do whatever. Same thing with the URL, same thing with the keyboard. I hope you have enjoyed this video.